Get into our net zero carbon segment brought to you by Convoy. Danny, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me. How you guys doing?
We're doing well here. And so, Danny, I'm excited to chat with you because there is a new proposal coming out and an infrastructure spending bill. How is this going to be impacting this world of net zero carbon?
So this one's pretty interesting. So it's investing in carbon capture. And so when we think about the ways to reduce our emissions and to keep global warming abate, there's the reduction side. And then more recently, there's been a focus on carbon capture. And so this is a signal to the market that the government is going to back investments in this area. And I think to put it in context, what's happening in emissions and sustainability, everyone is trying to put tools into the toolbox, so to speak. And so this is just one of the ways that we can think about introducing technology to pull carbon out of the air, CO2 out of the air, and a lot of things are storing it, so putting it back into retired oil and gas wells, that's one way of doing it. When you think about that, there's not a real revenue generating side of that. You're not creating a product, right? And so I think the interesting thing about carbon capture is when we go and create a circular life cycle for the carbon, right? When we're taking the carbon out of the air and then we are selling that back into industrial processes or creating plastics or creating alternative fuels. That is kind of the interesting and exciting part of where this could go. This is just the first signal to say, hey, in addition to all the other demand signals that are out there, the government's also sending their signal, which is interesting. They're creating four hubs where they're going to have these facilities that will be looking at carbon capture. The reality is this is early days, and that the facilities that are in practice today or in operations today are proving out a concept. They're not at scale, nor are they doing a meaningful amount of carbon sequestration at this point. But it is, again, we are early innings in some of this stuff, and it's about thinking about all the different ways that we can look at offering solutions for reducing emissions.
I think that's really interesting. We're talking about $3.5 billion in terms of investment from the infrastructure bill on this carbon capture technology. Knowing countries in terms of emissions, China being a majority and a dominant force with their coal-fired plants, do you think this could also represent a national security strategy where we not only invest in carbon capture, but then we can literally capture this excess carbon from other countries and then sell the materials on the open market?
Very interesting. Time will tell. I'm not an expert in global trade or trade security by that means. But I think Thomas, what is interesting is that in the sustainability side of things, a lot of this is helping around onshoring or nearshoring our resources and creating more independence when it relates to energy or potentially other resources that we may need from other countries. What we've seen through COVID, what we've seen through the lockdowns, what we've seen through Russia and Ukraine is that there are these whipsaws that come in that we have a lot of control over. And so you think about, if you just look at sustainability in a vacuum and you think about the goals that they have and what ambitions there are from an energy perspective, that very much ends up being the same things you think about when you think about energy security. And so when we have these combined, when we have these efforts that have multifaceted benefits, that's very interesting. And I think, just touching on the carbon capture side of things alone, some of the criticisms to carbon capture is that it's helping industries, energy industries, heavy industrial industries, heavy emitting industries, put a Band-Aid on what they're doing and not focus on the reduction side of things. And so with any of these headline efforts, there's a lot of appeal to, you see it sounds like a lot of money. In reality, it's not a lot of money to stand up a whole carbon capture industry, but it's a signal and it creates headlines, much like EV, I think, where we need to be careful when we hear about these efforts, because while they're interesting to talk about and they grab our attention, there's still a lot of nuances what's happening within our sustainability as a global community, right? At the end of the day, what we need to be focusing on is reducing our reliance on hydrocarbons and creating an economy that doesn't rely on those. And so, you know, EV will only take us so far. Carbon capture will play a role. How that all, you know, fits into global trade and national security. There will be, you know, benefits that come along with it. But I think staying focused on really the problem, which is reliance on hydrocarbons, is one of the key things that we need to focus on, and understanding how these technologies fit into context of that is really, I think, it's paramount to us understanding, you know, where we need to put our energy.
Yeah, Danny, I think that's a great and an excellent point. I mean, when you look at all these initiatives, they're awesome, but we also need to do our part as well in reducing some of the usage and some of our output. When you're looking at this project that's being kickstarted here, we have a goal by 2050 to meet net zero carbon for sure. How does projects like this kind of continue to evolve or maybe develop over that time frame? Are there any things that you're watching coming from this? As you mentioned, it's early days, but is there anything that this can kind of, you know, maybe snowball into that can have an even larger effect?
I think the alternative fuel side, we all know our good friend Tyler, who's has a life mission to help us reduce transportation. So passionate that he went into a space where they capture carbon at the company he's at, Infinium, and they look at creating synthetic fuels off of that. That type of stuff, or like going back into plastics, the circularness of it is really interesting. The capture and store is a good. It's the net benefit there, right? But at the end of the day, how do we create more of a circularness to the life cycle of carbon and use it to create more sustainable fuels? That's an interesting bridge to really getting to net zero. So those are the types of things that I think I get excited about. Are what is next. The carbon capture is the early stages, and there's a lot of companies who have pilots who have partnered. Carbon engineering has done, I think, with Occidental, where they're looking to make a lot of investments in creating carbon capture facilities. But again, they're still in pilot phases. So we're early innings on the capturing, and then we're still early innings on what do we do with the carbon once we've captured it. Putting it back into the system is much better in my mind than putting it back in and storing underground.
Thinking about one case study is it looks like Iceland, which removes 10 metric tons of CO2 every day with their carbon capture technology. You know, is this something where you talked about we're in the early innings? Is Iceland kind of leading the way, or are there anything domestically we should keep our eyes out in terms of people who are developing those processes and developing those use cases?
Yeah, there's a lot of global initiatives here domestically. Carbon engineering is, I believe, based out of Canada, but they're doing a lot of the implementations of projects here in the States. And so there are a lot of companies who are, at the end of the day, when I'm talking to different companies and trying to research throughout this space, it is just inspiring to see how many people are looking to tackle this problem. Obviously, they're trying to stand up businesses. There's revenue incentive for them to do so. It's the clear demand signal that from the government, from carbon capture credits that are being sold, that the market wants to see this happen. And so it's incentivizing companies to really stand up and to fill this space. And so there's a host of firms who are looking to do it. And it doesn't feel there's enough space and enough demand, and hopefully it sends a signal to bring more people. We always joke on the product side that you want to be a settler, not a pioneer. But it does look like there's a lot of pioneers out there who are trying to forge the way for other like-minded companies and individuals to come in and to really bring this to scale.
And Danny, you mentioned something I think really crucial there, and that's incentives. I mean, you think about economics in my mind, of course, so much of it is built off of incentives. When you start to get into some gray areas and nuances, can you dive into some of those incentives a little bit more to just kind of talk to what's out there to kind of keep this moving forward?
So a government investment, that's obviously sending a sign and has dollars that people can apply for the projects, right? Carbon credits. So the way the carbon credits are structured, there's a whole host different types of projects that can get qualified and can earn credits. And so some of those are, protecting forestry. Some are replanting trees. And then there's carbon capture, and each one has a price associated with it depending on kind of the complexity of those projects. Carbon capture tends to be the most expensive certificate that you can purchase out there. And what companies are doing, the leading companies are saying, yes, we could buy a carbon credit that is a reforestation project for $10 to $15 per metric ton. We could do that, and we are doing that. We're also going to spend $100, $1,000 a credit to send a signal to invest into these projects. And in a lot of cases, people are choosing to be investors in the projects to have the upfront capital investment before the credits are actually minted. And so it's sending a signal to the community that there's large corporate buyers of these carbon certificates, we'll call them, or technologies that is really fueling this upfront investment. And those signals are good. And it's interesting because they feel, I think there's some criticism around what's happening in sustainability and climate finance. In some situations, people just haven't really bought into the concept, but it is driven by demand, right? At the end of the day, corporates are feeling pressure or are motivated to invest into technologies or projects that are helping to reduce emissions. And that is flowing into, sending a demand signal into the community. And because of that, people are putting dollars behind projects like carbon capture. And so, Anthony, I think right now it feels like a market-driven approach from the voluntary market space, because there is no global regs or even domestic regulations that are saying that you must buy voluntary carbon credits. I mean, the name says, it's in the name, it's voluntary, right? And so that, I think, is sending a huge signal. The incentive is that people are willing to pay for it.
Thank you so much, Danny. I'm definitely looking forward to continuing to watch this development, and I will eventually start my own carbon capture farm, maybe in the next 5-10 years. Definitely exciting to see this technology.
Thank you.
Coming up, we have another edition of FreightWaves Classic. Don't touch that internet dial. We're sending it your way.